Hey all, this is Jeremy Baker with your Sociology of Poverty lecture, lecture 2.1, Measuring Poverty. In this lecture, we're going to talk about some very basic statistics. Then we'll talk about the idea of American exceptionalism. We're going to talk about defining poverty, some responses to poverty, and we're not going to talk about this week's assignments because that's from previous version of the course, and that shouldn't be on the slide. So, and I know some people have some emotional baggage with statistics, but I promise I'm not going to get too complex about it. There are three basic types of statistical averages, and this is really the very basic information you need to kind of understand conversations about poverty. It's important stuff. That's why I'm sharing it. We have our mean, our median, and our mode. So when we say average, if you're a real smart person or you portray yourself as smart, you can say, well, what kind of average, right? And I promise I won't get too mathy. So, brief side note on terms. Most data in sociology and other social sciences can be divided into quantitative or qualitative categories. Our quantitative data is numeric data, things like statistics. Those are quantitative. But we also have qualitative data, which is data that can't put into numbers. This is pictures, observations you make in a workplace, how people feel, how much you love your wife, whatever, right? That's qualitative data. So the first of our things that we call an average is the mean. And usually, actually, when we talk about averages, we are talking about means. This is the number that we call an average. Basically, what you do is you add all the numbers together. You can divide them by your number of numbers. Yeah, there are better mathematical terms to use, but this is the basics. So an example of figuring out a mean is that if you add 5 plus 10 plus 30, and you divide that by 3, the mean of those is 15. The median then is the middle number in a number line, right? And when I was in elementary and high school, I was always like, why are you idiots lining up things in a line of numbers from littlest to smallest? There's a real reason for it, right? Medians are actually very important in understanding poverty, and this is something I didn't understand until grad school. So, for example, on this line from 1 to 17, 9 is the number that is in the middle, right? That we're interested in which number is exactly in the middle. And we'll discuss later in the course why this is actually a very helpful statistic. Both the mean and the median can be useful when studying income. However, due to social factors, due to statistics, really what we have is a tremendous inequality in the United States that's created what we call polarization in the United States. And that's, again, something we'll be revisiting over and over again. As in the next slide, almost like I wrote these things. A related concept is income polarization. So for the past 50 years, incomes have been polarizing in the United States. Polarization is defined simply as things separating and moving toward two opposite sides or poles. Polarizing, going from one pole to the other and really collecting in those places. Political polarization is something we're a little bit more familiar with in the United States. This is the misperception that everything can be divided into Democrat thing or Republican thing. That is political polarization. And then what we're going to be talking about for most of this course, we're going to be talking about income polarization. the phenomena of getting many, many, many very poor people and a couple very, 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 very rich people, right? You can't have billionaires without wildly poor people. And that's something you can understand by doing kind of basic math. Most people don't really understand the colossal difference between $1 million and $1 billion. It's wild. So in other words, as I said, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Specifically, the rich are getting very, very rich, and the poor are actually about as poor as they've always been. The issue that we see that's most common is that middle income people who were for a long time in the United States, the majority of people, middle income people are their income is lowering. Thus, because of this dramatic income polarization, median becomes a better gauge of what is the average American income as opposed to mean, because a mean statistic is highly susceptible to skew while a median is not. So really good illustration on this top picture. And again, if you're not a big stats person, I can make this relatively simple for you. If you were to take the median American income, I'm sorry, I misspoke, the mean American income, and you look at this chart, it would be about $200,000 per person if you included the mega, mega, mega rich at the very top of the scale, right? But if you include the median income, the numbers on the number line, because there's a very few numbers on the number line along the top, it would be somewhere in the range of, oh, that looks like about $30,000 to $40,000 is what this chart says, which is, it's a much more average income than $200,000 a year for one person. Not a household, but a person. The mode then is the number that occurs most commonly in a set of data. This is less useful when talking about income, however. So, for example, what is your religion? This is again a stats thing. I could ask you A, Muslim, are you B, Christian, are you C, Christian Catholic, so Christian Protestant or Christian Catholic, or are you D, Buddhist? Really, yeah, sure. Did we ask are people Jewish? Did we ask are people Hindu? Did we ask are people Zoroastrian, right? There's a lot of religions we didn't include here. You choose your categories based on what you expect to find most often. That's a kind of basics of statistical, and you could definitely talk about underrepresentation and all that stuff, but that's for another course. Thus, if you have 100 people, you're asking them about their faith identity, the data could look like this. And this isn't designed to be representative, it's just an example. 20 people could answer A, Muslim. 50 people could answer B, Christian, Protestant. 20 people could answer Christian, Catholic. And then 10 people could answer D, Buddhist. So for this example, the average, the mode that is the most is B, Christian Protestant. That is the most number of people in this example. As a general rule, as I think I've hammered you over the head with, modes are most useful with this kind of data, and means and medians are more useful with, again, the things we more typically think of as being averages. The most common way for sociologists to gather these averages and other quantitative data is through surveys. The survey we're probably most familiar with in the United States, and because it is the largest, the oldest, and one of the most organized surveys in the world, is the US Census. But there certainly are other surveys that exist in the social scientific world. Social scientists often makes their own surveys. That's absolutely also a point. And then surveys are often deployed by agencies that help poor or needy people. That is something that very much exists. Are there problems there? Yeah, there are. There's problems in everything, but those are the people that do the surveys. So here we have, and if you squint real small or you use your awesome eyes, a U.S. Household Food Security Survey mode, a 6-item short form from the Economic Research Service of the USDA. So this is a survey that would be distributed to people using a food bank. And the people going to the food bank to get some food assistance, they would be required to fill out this form before actually getting their stuff, right? And that is an entirely ethical thing to do. Why would we give this survey? Are we doing this because we're spying on people? Are we doing this because we want to round up people or shame people who are using the food bank? Absolutely not. We are looking to see what populations and what groups and what areas are most needy so that hypothetically we could help them in the future. That's why we do these sorts of surveys. When studying poverty, we often study the income of the individual compared to the poverty line. I should also state either the income of the individual or the income of a household. That's two different ways to look at it. This not only gives us an idea about general living conditions of the person or the family, it also tells us what federal, state, or local programs the individual could qualify for. So to qualify at 100% of poverty, this person would make as much as the poverty line. What is the number of the poverty line? We'll talk about that in a minute. 125% of poverty means that the person makes 25% more than the poverty line. 150% of the poverty means they make the poverty line plus half of that number, right? And then 200% of the poverty line means you make twice as much as the poverty line. And that is still a very valid thing. Those 200% of poverty statistics, those tend to be things that we want to make sure absolutely everyone who needs it has access to a given service. So let's talk more about American exceptionalism. I am sorry, I believe the statistics slide that I was talking about relating to what the poverty line is, I think I bumped that to the end of this presentation actually. So each society has its own challenges in terms of helping people who are experiencing poverty in the United States. But one of the major barriers in our society is this concept of American exceptionalism. This is a cultural barrier that we have to deal with. The definition there being the idea that the United States is the best country to live in the world, it's the best place to possibly be in the world, and then also an ugly part of that is some people think, well, no, there are no poor people in the United States, or, well, it's not really that bad to be poor in the United States. So these are dramatic misconceptions. And the reason we believe these things, that we want to believe these things, that we're number one, is because it's okay to like where you live, right? It's okay to be proud of who you are and where you're from, but the concept of America is the best often masks how bad American poverty can be. And that's that masking denial element of it. That's the big problem. For example, when we look at Appalachian poverty, there are communities in the Appalachian region that are as poor as those areas that are called third world that suffer from similar maladies related to poverty. So there are people in the poorest parts of South America who are suffering from lack of access to healthcare, lack of shelter, lack of clean drinking water, just like people living in the United States, in eastern Kentucky, in other parts of the Appalachian region that are suffering in those very similar ways, getting diseases like scurvy and rickets and cholera, right? diseases that we don't think of as being something else, as being weird old-timey diseases. There are people in our own country, not very far from Columbus, that are experiencing those things. So now let's look more into actually defining poverty itself. So when studying any phenomena, one of the first things you have to figure out is what exactly do you mean, right? What do you mean by that? I like to say, how do you define that thing, right? And there are so many definitions of poverty. So let's look at a few. Relative deprivation is one way of viewing poverty. This is the condition of feeling poor, right? You're unable to have the same standard of living as those in your community. And if you live in a very rich area, being unable to afford 2 vacations a year, for example, you could feel relatively deprived. If you lived in, say, Dublin, Ohio, or Powell, Ohio, and not being able to go on vacation and not being able to buy a new car, by the standards of those communities, that could make you feel poor. But it can absolutely go the other way. If you live in a poor area and you're not financially suffering like other people around you, you can feel relatively privileged as well, right? It's very much about human social interaction. Absolute deprivation, though, is that your lack of money puts you in physical danger. It affects your health. So examples of absolute deprivation can be not being able to afford enough food or not being able to afford healthy food. We're going to talk about malnutrition in the United States and its relationship with food deserts in a couple lectures. Not being able to afford health care. That's one that's really big and critical in the United States. Not being able to afford heating. In Ohio, that is a definition of absolute deprivation. Your house is cold in the winter because you can't afford to make it warm. Or if you're in the South, not being able to get your house cool enough in the summer. It's the same general phenomena. Not being able to fix a critical part of your house or afford rent to not be evicted. This is also elements of absolute deprivation. And as I alluded to, and as the following slides are going to point out, we think of absolute deprivation as being something that doesn't exist in the United States, but the very sad, stark reality is it absolutely exists in the United States. So we have a distinct tendency to think of absolute poverty as something happening, quote, over there. So this top image is a very infamous image from, I think the organization was called Save the Children, something very like that. This was a magazine ad wherein 2 children were sitting by a bowl, eating with their hands out of the bowl, and it says above it, their last meal, and then the caption said, the food ran out the day this photograph was taken. There's so many elements there. Why didn't the photographer help, right? Are these children like a foot tall? What exactly is happening here? Are these real children? Obviously, major components of this were skewed in a major way, and then you can even start implying the racist connotations of this, that African children, those are the children that starve, right? Certainly white children don't starve. Not understanding that that type of food vessel, right, is actually much bigger than our bowls, right? These aren't actually teeny tiny children. There's layers upon layers of this. Poverty absolutely also exists in the United States. According to the Mid-Ohio Food Bank, 1 in 4 children in Franklin County experience hunger regularly. That means monthly at least. What absolute poverty looks like in the United States often, that isn't to say that everyone that has a cluttered yard is in a condition of absolute poverty, but it looks a little bit more like this lower image, especially in rural areas in the United States. Having grown up in a relatively poor area, there were a lot of places near my hometown that looked very much like this kind of Appalachian pastiche, if you will. Some other quick definitions for understanding poverty. Income being the money you make in a year. So this is the money it's the money that you make. It's actually relatively easy to understand because most of us have some experience with income. Wealth is a little harder to understand because a lot of us don't have much in terms of wealth. Wealth is the total assets you have, including money, the money you have saved, stocks and bonds. These are the wealth in our society. Very few people in our society have any wealth. Most people don't have very much wealth at all. The most common form of wealth in the United States that used to be more common was a home, a house, right? Property like that. That is wealth. And that's actually becoming less common as well. The type of wealth that hyper rich people have that we don't have, we're talking about things like McDonald's franchises, real estate in expensive cities, stuff like that. Stuff that the hyper, there's a reason we call very rich people wealthy, because they have a lot of wealth. Poverty can be measured either in income, your assets, or wealth. Income-based measures are more commonly used to measure poverty, as opposed to asset-based measures, which are used to measure wealth. So income being the money you have coming in, your assets being the stuff you have. This slide's a little repetitive, admittedly. Data shows that wealth inequality is actually much worse than income inequality. I have a film clip I'll probably show later in the course. However, it may be helpful in specific circumstances to take wealth into consideration. So there are some people who are poor that actually have a fair amount of landed property. This is a little bit more common among poor rural people. So if you have a farm but you don't have much income, there is a certain survivability to that, right? You can actually grow food. That's becoming far less common, that kind of situation in the United States due to big agribusiness, but it does indeed exist. And then here's that slide that I skipped from before. Poverty is measured in comparison to the federal poverty line and state lines. So in this slide, we see it's showing you that the poverty line is based on where you live, and it varies from person to person. So one person who is considered under the poverty line has a different number than another person due to their lived circumstances. It has to do with, largely has to do with your household family size. So you as an individual, if your money you have coming in per month and you're just one person living by yourself, if you make less than about $1,200 per month, that is considered under the poverty line. So if you're under that poverty line, then you qualify for those programs that are at 100% of poverty, right? But if you live in a household of 4, you see that it's up to $2,500 a month, largely because it takes more to feed more people, right? And then you see, so really what we see with this slide is that there are so many variables to it, and this is a big part of what social workers do, actually, is try to figure out, like, okay, what programs do these people classify for? It's an intensely complex process. Okay, well, that is it for this lecture. If you have any questions, if there's anything that happens with the readings, anything that happens with the online classroom, please just let me know.